So I think we solved it. We did it. All right, so that's my that's that. I hope all of that made sense. I was very nervous because this stuff gets really thorny. There are a lot of people who are suggesting, like, maybe the Nazis have something, maybe we should hear what they have to say, both sides, right? And that's not what I'm trying to do. That's not my, I'm all for punching Nazis. That's my hot take of the day.
It's come up a lot.
Yeah.
It's like with people in our class. It's like, would you punch a Nazi?
That's a good thing. That's a good thing.
It's the question of our era, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Or maybe that is fortunate. I don't know. Maybe not the question, but thank you so much. That was no idea what a wonderful treat we were in for. When I'm glad I knew that it would be a wonderful treat to have you, but you put a lot of work into that, and that was incredible.
To be fair, this is stuff that I've thought about for a long time, so I was just kind of like dictating my thoughts that I already had. So.
Well, I feel very fortunate that we got to be here to receive. Thank you. That's great. So you're going to stick around for a while for our discussion?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, that's awesome. Do you have discussion questions in mind? Do you want me to?
No, I kind of want to hear. I've talked for a while, so I want to hear what everybody else says.
Do you think representation has gotten worse as time has gone on since that era?
Absolutely. This is an interesting thing that studying film, especially like in the 40s and 50s, and looking at Hollywood. If you watch His Girl Friday, if you watch Big Sleep, these are films with like really strong female characters. The Big Sleep is a detective noir story involving investigating murder, starring Humphrey Bogart. In that film, like Humphrey Bogart gets into a taxi cab and is driven by a woman, and she's like flirting with him, and she's like, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" And like wants to get together with him. He goes into a bookstore, and it's like the same thing. And this has been criticized by some people as like everybody's sexually attracted to Humphrey Bogart, but I see it as, look at these women who have sexual agency. You don't see that today. And it's like there's more female characters in that film than there are male. So it does seem like it has gotten a lot worse.
Do you think it is primed for change because of all the women that are getting back into Hollywood after last year's sexual predator removal?
Oh yeah, I've thought for a long time that the next big revolution in Hollywood, if we're talking in terms of the boom in the 40s, moving on to the boom in the 60s and 70s, moving on to the boom in the 90s, like each of those have different causes. I've thought for a long time that once we start seeing more people of color, more queer people, more women in the position of producers, that's going to be the next big, like, everybody gives a shit about film again, because those are stories we haven't seen. And I feel like we are on the cusp of that, because Black Panther has made all of the money. And that's like, for years, Hollywood studios have said, no, these movies don't make money. It's like, we make one movie that has like more than 3 women in it, and it fails. And it's like, see, nobody wants to see a movie with a woman in it, when it's like, you made like 6 movies with Paul Rudd, and none of them made any money. You're not saying that like Paul Rudd isn't a moneymaker. So like that logic is finally starting to break down. So I feel like, unless, I mean, this is Trump's America, so it's like, it doesn't matter what happens, it just, everything keeps going backwards. But it feels like things could really be turning around.
Do you think we could get a mulligan on The Last Airbender, please?
The live action.
Yeah,
the
last
was not a film.
Oh my God.
That's such a weird thing in general, because it's directed by M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah, can you just stop making movies though?
Well, I mean, that's a good request, but it's such a strange, because if you're thinking about like who is the person who's going to fuck up that tremendous.
I wouldn't have expected.
No, yeah, he's a person of color. You'd think that like that's something that he would at least be sensitive to.
It was weird that like all the bad guys were Middle Eastern and everyone else
he
was
switched
white.
it. It's so bizarre. It's such a strange choice. It doesn't make any sense.
I'm sure it's watched it. I watched the beginning. I was like, I can't.
Oh no, it's bad.
It's awful.
weird,
It's
no.
Oh,
so
it's bad, and it's made worse by the fact that it's an adaptation of like the best cartoon.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Well, and like both of the
The Inheritance Circle by the Aragon series, the movie was pitiful, but the books are amazing.
I never read Aragon. That's something I've always been told I should give a chance, I guess, when I was a young adult.
Yeah, Aragon. Okay.
I was just gonna say that the show creators of Avatar and The Last Airbender are both like Eastern philosophy professors and put a lot of like, work into like
Yeah, and
really
they're both right.
reverently portraying like Eastern
Yes,
philosophy, and it did a really good
That's-
job of introducing a lot of really cool
Yes.
themes to kids.
And that's an incredible
And
example.
the most tone deaf film adaptation possible
Yeah,
is what we got. For
and
it.
and that's a great example of like why the nuance is important, because
Yeah.
it isn't as clear as white people bad, everybody else good.
Right, it's more that this should have been about like
Yeah.
giving like young Asian American children like good role models
Yeah,
and
exactly.
like a big like theatrical
Yeah,
but instead
yeah, no.
I'm glad I wasn't the only one that hated that movie.
I think a lot of people hated that.
Yeah, it's bad.
I think I hated it too quickly, so I didn't get to see all the reasons to hate it. Because I
It's not even a fun bad
Yeah,
movie.
it's really
Like
not. It wasn't funny.
the Happening is a fun bad movie. Like that's a movie you can watch and get drunk to, but Avatar is just sad and boring.
So what did you come up with in the question that I asked at the beginning? Like, is there a responsibility to address issues of representation? It's kind of on the surface, it seems like an obvious, like you're supposed to say yes kind of question.
I said no because they don't necessarily have like an obligation to represent them, but they do have an obligation to represent them accurately, is what I think.
Yeah.
I said like kind of the same thing, like it's like their own creation, so they don't have to like tailor it to like anything, but I don't think they should make it like unfairly represent certain groups of people. But like you said in your presentation, like if you want to make like a movie about a straight white man who's just very average in every way, then go for it. But like, I don't know, just think about it first.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of my approach to it. Like, if you want to tell the same story or whatever, that's fine. But at least consider these other things.
Yeah.
Like, you're not obligated to, but think about it.
I thought it was interesting that you chose that word obligation, because a thought that I've had for a long time is I feel like a creator's obligation is not to include all of these identities, but to be aware of the context in which their story will be presented. Like the only obligation you have is to not make bad choices, essentially. Like to choose whether you're being exclusive.
I focus on the word obligation as well. I sort of kind of spun it more in the direction of like it's probably good to convince media creators that they should have a vested interest in representation as opposed to obligate. Yeah, I definitely agree that accurate representation is better than like trying to shoehorn in like token characters all the time.
I think that so when I was asking the question, I was intentionally making this list of potential people to have or not have that obligation. So on the one end was film, or, the production companies, right? The companies that themselves are just funding and providing the facilities and managing the expenses and raking in the profits on the one hand, and then producers, directors, writers. Because in my mind, that range of, I don't want to call it degrees of artistic involvement, but maybe it is, interestingly, and this is my own take on it, not necessarily a well thought out take, that the companies that are making the money kind of in my mind have more of an obligation in my view to do that, because they're making the money. I feel that their responsibility is to their customers or to the culture that they're making money in that context. And I think the closer you get to a person who's creating art or the person writing the script or the person directing. I think that it becomes more about artistic choices and vision.
Yeah.
Community. I was wondering if we would get there.
Yeah.
Me too. In other words, I think that those companies
It is.
have a responsibility.
Yeah, well, they're the ones who write the checks. They're the ones who make the possibilities, and that's the big hurdle. Is if we could have all of the diverse directors and writers and actors that we wanted, but if the producers, the production companies, decided that all they wanted was The Sandlot over and over and over again. That's the end of the conversation. And so the production companies are at the top, like just so white, just blinding. So that's a huge hurdle, and that's not something that there's a clear like. You're not going to march outside of a corporation and be like, hey, change your board of directors or whatever. Like that's a very big problem. It's hard to know how to address it. Because there's also not a lot, like voting with your dollar isn't really effective because like Disney owns everything. Disney's making all of the money. So what do you do?
Is the this is a question for you, but for anybody who wants to address it. And I don't know if everybody's read about that. We did not have a reading on this topic this semester in the course packet. But the issue of trans representation, and specifically cisgender actors playing trans roles.
Yes.
We talked
Have
about
you talked about
Yeah.
this? Okay.
Okay.
Molly was very enthusiastic about it, I think.
Okay, that's right. That was. But when do you?
Yeah.
Does that fall into it's the individual film versus the
Yeah, that's
context?
something that is I've spent. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it because I know a lot of people who are very vehement, like a trans actor should be playing a trans role. I'm not sure that I agree because to me, I don't know. Like this is one of those things I haven't really made up my mind. I don't know that there is like an answer that is 100% true, because it kind of depends on the context. There's a film called Trans America, where it's a trans woman who is about to have sex reassignment surgery, and she finds out that she has a son, and she's traveling across the country with him, and the actress playing the main character is a woman, a cisgender woman. So I really like that film. You know, I don't know how it holds up today. It's been a long time since I've seen it. I don't know. It's difficult. Like you also talk about Eddie Redmayne playing in whatever that film was that he was nominated for an Oscar for. Where that, you could argue that that's not. It's like I don't think that was particularly tasteful. I don't know. It's like you got to take it on a case by case basis, but then it's also like it falls along like where we draw these lines of identity, because if we take that same conversation and we say, why don't we have a white actor playing Black Falcon? What? I'll just say Luke Cage. Why don't we have a white actor playing Luke Cage? You know, why not? And it's the answer is there's a long history of blackface in Hollywood. That's kind of like that's a taboo. That's why you can't do it. And so I guess maybe part of it is that there isn't so much the history of sort of cultural parody in that kind of direct way, but there is. That's the thing is like it's hard to know. Like these identity boundaries are already so opaque and difficult. You know, it's easier to point at like racial differences and say like this is where we draw the line. But when it comes to gender and sexuality, like I've heard people say that a straight person shouldn't play a gay person. And it's like, I don't know, you know, I can see the case for that. I can see the case against it. And it's sort of, It depends.
Do you think that the actor that is playing that role has the obligation to become educated? Like,
Oh,
Well, yeah, if you want to.
Absolutely.
I mean, like, I was thinking like it connects back to like the obligation the company has to represent all those different things accurately.
yeah, that, and even that actually gets a little messy because what does that mean, education? Like, does that mean spending 12 hours a day every day for 6 months living with a trans person, like studying them? Because at that point they become like an anthropological object. Like you're studying a trans person as if you're, yeah.
I agree, but then that's also kind of how method acting works with any subject.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing though is that I'm highly critical of method acting.
I
Yeah,
don't
that's-
like method acting.
Yeah, no, I think Daniel Day-Lewis is a piece of shit, but that's
Why?
Well, he's a great actor. I think he's.
I don't know much about him as a person. I'm
He's
just
just.
curious.
I don't know. He just. I don't like his. I don't like the cut of his jib. I don't know.
All right.
I guess a better example would be Jared Leto.
Uh-huh.
But it's yeah.
I think a big part of the issue though is that like, okay, going back to the last Airbender problem, I don't think that there weren't Asian children that auditioned for the role of Aang.
Mhm.
And so I think that if like typically white cisgender actors are getting all of the roles over people that actually belong to the groups that you're trying to represent, then
Yeah.
that's when it I don't know. I mean, I think it should probably be a fair race for a role.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is that there aren't a lot of trans actors in Hollywood who have the clout that they would be cast in a movie that might get an Oscar nomination. I can think like there's it's basically people that are on Netflix at this point. There's Jamie Clayton. There's in Orange Is the New Black. I can't remember her name. I feel bad.
So-
again.
No, that's the characters. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember her name. But
Laverne.
yeah, Laverne Cox. There we
Cox.
go. Yeah. Like, they're both incredible. But it's like those are the only two that I can think of off the top of my head. But we had, I believe this year, first trans person won an Oscar. There's a documentary short form. It was a person of color won best short form documentary. Should say first trans person to win an Oscar that we know of. But that documentary is specifically about that person's mother, I believe, and their like quest to find answers about some question. I haven't seen it, but it seems very good. But so things are definitely getting better in that regard, and it does like there's an argument about what culpability do casting agents have, because they're the ones who choose from their pool of actors they represent, like who goes into the audition. But that also comes to like they know the directors, so they know like if they've sent a handful of people of color in to audition for parts, and that director consistently turns down those actors, that casting agent then knows this director will not cast people of color, and their job is to get people jobs. So it's like they're just not going to send those roles off. So it's this complex web of like, you say, I'm sure that there were Asian kids who auditioned for the role of Aang. It's entirely possible that they never got to that point because
The casting agent.
because the casting agent, or maybe M. Night Shyamalan himself explicitly said this is not an Asian character. It's possible. That's the thing, is that there's so many layers. It's difficult.
What are other I'm asking everybody in the room at the moment, other areas where representation may be an issue that's not as visible, but still, or like, we sort of become aware of things in waves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we had our Bechtel test era 5-8 years ago,
Yeah.
right, where the Bechtel test came out and people started realizing, wow, yes, all of these female characters almost never talk to each other, and when they do, it's usually about one of the male characters. And then, and so Hollywood sort of gradually built into the system, like write a scene.
Yeah,
Just so we pass the Bechdel test. Yeah, and kind of got, but then then maybe 2 and 3 years ago and up to now, we're sort of having a conversation about trans representation, and I've heard the term trans face to connect it rhetorically to blackface, which I think is
that's a bit of a reach.
I'm uncomfortable with that leap
Yeah.
myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've heard that. Are there other like who else is missing that are even systematically missing? I mean,
I think I thought of this while you were giving your presentation. Another form of misrepresentation is, I know you talked about how there are a little like gay representation, right? For people thinking it's foreign or whatever. And I completely agree with that in the sense of if it's a male and a male. But I feel like if it's girl on girl, then it's totally encouraged because it's just sexualized in a completely different way. So I just thought of a specific movie, Atomic Blonde, which I don't recommend. But it has a sex scene with 2 girls, but like it wasn't there because like, yes, representation. It was like, ooh, look at this is sexual, and more male viewers.
Like to say that movie was terrible.
Yeah, so
Oh boy.
That's actually something I'm going to talk about in my paper.
that's what I was
I actually have it on my DVR right now. I should just delete it.
Yes.
Just
Okay.
Sort of talking about like the
I saw the
origins
title. I was like,
of,
I've heard of that.
I'm to the movie too.
of the character Supergirl, and how when Supergirl was first introduced to comics, she was like not only like as powerful as Superman, but also was like the first female superhero to get her own cover, but then also to not be overly sexualized, but then she wasn't selling. And DC realized that their audience was not young women, but young boys, and so they started sexualizing Supergirl. And so a lot of times, like a perceived audience can get in the way of like representation being like productive.
Oh, yeah.
And like, yeah, I definitely think that with lesbians, I feel like they're often sexualized for male audiences.
We're in the territory where it might be good to also cross into talking about video games, which I know you also know about.
Mm-hmm.
Two things. I actually really like Atomic Blonde, but it is difficult. I actually looked at it in class recently, and that conversation is challenging. I enjoyed it. I don't know. Mileage may vary, right? And we don't have to have that conversation. But I'm generally way more forgiving of films. Like I really like action movies, so for me, it's like I can take the sexual politics of that film are bad, but I really like a lot of the choreography.
yeah, I feel like it's a little different, especially coming from a female. Like I don't
Absolutely.
want to be represented like that. So I get your
No.
point.
Yeah, no, as far as another group that is, or I don't know if group is the right word, but generally, every movie that you see, very thin, very conventionally beautiful, able-bodied. A huge problem for me growing up was just the lack of overweight people on screen, except as stereotypes, as like gross, slovenly people who are unhealthy and all of this, and it's like that's something that I still. I have a gripe about Blade Runner 2045. Yeah, the new one. 2049. Yeah. I really like that film. I actually think it's a better movie than the original. It's controversial because I think the original Blade Runner is a legendary film because it's bad, and it's accidentally brilliant. But anyway, one of the things that I really like about that is that there are so many old actors. Everybody has like these textured, grizzled faces. Everybody just like looks weird. And then in the new one, it's fucking Ryan Gosling. And like all of these like beautiful people, it's Jared Leto and just smooth faces. And it's like, I can't remember what any of them look like. Everybody has to look a certain way. You go back just a couple decades and you have all of these interesting faces and body types and shapes. And that's just gone away. Everything's become like polished to a shine. And that's something that I miss a lot. Like
You mentioned Game of Thrones. There's a character in Game of Thrones that was so ridiculously changed. It's like, I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head, but in the books he has like a rainbow colored beard and he's kind of overweight and like he's like a really kind of unlikable character, and they made him like this like suave, pretty assassin, like
Yeah.
chiseled. Like,
Yeah. There's a lot of that.
it's like this white dude. It's not at all what that character was
Yeah,
supposed to be.
absolutely. There's a lot of that too.
Okay, but you were asking who else was missing, and I actually, especially if we want to transition to video games, because I think it's as true in video games.
Although I also
Native
think there's
Americans.
different issues in video, but yeah, it's true.
There's actually a really critically acclaimed video game that kind of had some issues with misusing some derogatory Native American slang that gets totally overlooked. Horizon Zero Dawn is constantly referring to people as braves and savages and things
Yep.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they claim that they did all this research to avoid doing that, but somehow all of that still needed
To claim that the ways that they do it are legitimate,
Yeah,
not
or-
bad ways.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I almost never see Native Americans represented in media without it being like gross stereotypes. Looking at you, Kimmy Schmidt.
Yeah.
What do you think about Assassin's Creed 3 with like Archimedes?
I didn't finish it because it was really buggy, honestly.
Yeah.
But so I didn't dig enough in to get a real feel on Native American representation.
Yeah, there's
I wasn't sure about that.
So there's a game called Never Alone, which is created using as a Canadian game. They financed it with Canadian government funds. It's basically a little platformer that is about Inupiat. I can't remember how to pronounce the name of that tribe, but their mythology. And you're basically playing through mythological tales, and they have interviews with members of that tribe. And you can, once you finish the level, you can go out into the menu and you watch these interviews, and you see specifically the visual elements that were playing out in the game, illustrated and like talked about as how they actually relate to that culture. So that's an example of very good representation. Although people criticize it, it's not a very good game. I think it's fine. Like the thing is, it's easy.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be because it's an educational tool more than anything.
Yeah.
It's just difficult enough. I think it's great. So you get into the similar territory as in Hollywood when we're talking about Assassin's Creed or Horizon Zero Dawn. These are multi-million-dollar games whose main focus is to turn a profit. Like they don't care. They don't care about anything else. So when they choose to try to do any kind of like representation, they're doing it for a reason. And that idea of, we've done our research and look how historically accurate it is. There's an ulterior motive to that.
Yeah.
And I know there are a lot of things that Horizon Zero Dawn got right. It's hard to say got right in that context because it's a post-apocalyptic future. So it's a fantasy essentially.
Right.
So like,
but it has like a strong female lead.
well, yeah, and
Hyper-representation.
I've heard some people say that they like some of the native themes that are explored in there. But yes, that your point is totally correct. Like there's a lot of misappropriated terms, and it's difficult.
And I've only ever seen one discussion of that, like ever since the game came out.
Yeah,
I'm sure plenty of people talk
it's sort
about
of all over the place.
Yeah.
So, did anybody else want to jump in? I have a thought about, I'm thinking about their papers.
Sure.
Which are coming in, was it 2 weeks from today? 14 days, the big research essay. So one of the points that you made in the presentation, and I'm sure I'm not going to represent it quite accurately, was essentially, in the case of an individual work, it's not necessarily responsible for the context.
Yeah.
It's problematic because of the context,
Yes.
but the artist or the artists behind it may not be as accountable to that context as sometimes we tend to try to hold them.
And in
Is
the
that
context of the Canadian game about Native American mythology, that's like putting a point on the board to skew the pattern back in the favor of not problematic, I guess is the way you could look at that, like sort of like a nuance, right? Like,
Yeah, but the flip side of that is, so we're desperately trying to change the pattern. So you create something that swings very far in the other direction. Now you say, whenever somebody brings up the argument, we don't have this representation, somebody points to that one.
There's
They
that
say,
one.
there it is, there it is.
So if, on what grounds, I don't know, so I'm just wondering if somebody's focusing on a specific work that they find problematic, at least in part because of that context. This is a sort of thorny question that there's not momentum enough to get us into the thorns, I guess the way I'm asking it. But like, how do you write about, so you, in your film studies classes, you're presumably often writing about films.
Yes.
And are these issues of problematic issues part of that conversation usually, or is it?
Well, it depends on what I'm looking at.
Okay.
I tend more towards intertextual analysis, so I don't touch that as much in my academic studies, because purely because to really give it justice, it requires like so much more work. But to me, I think it is important to at least acknowledge to some extent.
I think my sort of approach to teaching an expository writing class, and I think most of academia's approach to teaching writing, is to find something to talk about and problematize that thing. Like let's focus on the problems, right? There's a problem here about gender representation just in the world, right? So I'm saying kind of go find something that exemplifies that problem and write about that. But I'm presuming, I don't know if it's accountability or an ethical obligation, as I put it at the beginning of the class, but I tend to assume that the individual work can be, at least in part, accountable for that bigger contextual problem.
Well, yeah, if we accept the premise that a pattern is unconscious, then and the creators are expressing the form of that pattern in their work unconsciously. So absolutely, you can then use the work as a small form representation of the pattern as a whole.
Yeah, well, I don't know, like I'm thinking of something like the tendency for a show to just, like if there are female characters who are young, like probably at some point the producers of the show are going to be like, let's have a scene where that person has to come out of the shower or whatever, like that kind of representation. Where it's just that, and so I'm watching a show right now that's doing that, like over, like every female character, is anybody watching Altered Carbon?
Oh yeah.
Netflix series. I'm watching it, and like it kind of did that a little bit at first, and then it stopped doing it for a few episodes. And then it was like somebody noticed, like, oh, there's this character, and we haven't seen her naked yet, and this one, and like, let's put the 3 scenes in a row or something. So I'm just, why did all of these scenes have to happen with this happen? Obviously, I could criticize Altered Carbon for doing that because it's part of a larger pattern, but I think there's also a level on which it's just Altered Carbon that's arbitrarily making those. You wanted to chime in, I thought, for a second.
Yeah, but I think I changed my mind.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, so if you unchange your mind, let me know, because I'm curious.
I just feel like I'm disagreeing with like everything, but I don't want to be that person.
No,
Oh, no,
please,
go ahead.
please.
Well, I know you're not speaking for every business or production of movies, but like for my essay, I'm writing about a specific film, 9 to 5, and the implications it has on women in the workplace. I'm also tackling like the wage gap, but the point is that I feel like the producers for that movie were very much aware of the fact that one specific female character, I think it's Dolly Parton, who has large breasts and likes, but she's loyal and she's married, but all the women in the office assume she's having sexual relations with the boss, and the boss encourages it, and so I think the producers were like definitely aware of that going on, and so like encouraged that. So like I just personally don't like giving people the benefit of the doubt.
Oh, I absolutely
Right.
don't give anybody the benefit of the doubt. I don't, again, like, none of this is meant to absolve anybody of that responsibility. And you're dead on with that. Again, like all of this is just my thoughts, my opinions, and again, like your perspective on this is just as valid as mine, if not more so. And it's that plurality of voices that I think is the most important thing. So yeah, no, I think that's a perfectly fair perspective to take.
I think that's a really good point on which to start wrapping up. So thank you again for hanging out and participating in our discussion.